The 911 call never came. The alarms that should have saved a child's life stayed silent. And when a 10-year-old girl lay dying in a mansion worth $30 million, surrounded by staff and security systems that cost more than most people make in a lifetime, it was the woman they paid $12 an hour who refused to let her die. But what she did next would land her in handcuffs, make her the target of a manhunt, and ultimately expose a truth so devastating that it would force one of the world's most powerful men to confront the one thing his money couldn't buy. The moment when doing right meant breaking every rule. This is the story of Tasha Briggs, a woman the world tried to make invisible, who became impossible to ignore. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe, give this video a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. Now, let's begin. Tasha didn't storm into the Lancaster mansion like some conquering hero. She slipped in quietly, the way people like her always did, through the service entrance, with her head down and her expectations lower. It had been exactly 3 days since Gregory Lancaster's estate manager handed her a mop, showed her to the cramped corner room designated for the help, and made it clear that her job was to clean, not to be seen. The Lancaster estate wasn't just a home. It was a fortress of white marble and bulletproof glass, perched high in the hills where the gates didn't just keep strangers out. They kept stories like Tasha's from ever getting in. Gregory Lancaster ruled this world with the cold precision of a man who'd built his empire by treating human emotion like a market inefficiency. Tech mogul, international trader, a man who spoke in quarterly projections and thought compassion was a liability. But every empire has its weakness, and Gregory's was sleeping in the sunroom upstairs. Vivian Lancaster, 10 years old, delicate as spun glass, moved through the mansion like a ghost haunting her own life. Sickle cell disease had taught her that pain was a constant companion, that her body was both home and prison. She didn't run down hallways or slam doors the way children should. She shuffled. She whispered. She existed in the spaces between other people's conversations, overlooked even by those paid to care for her. Most of the staff treated Vivian like expensive furniture, something to dust around, keep safe, but never really engage with. They made sure her medications were refilled, her meals were warm, her rooms were spotless. That was enough. That was what they were paid for. But Tasha noticed things others didn't. The way Vivian's footsteps sounded more like whispers against the marble floors. How her smiles cracked at the edges like old paint. The tremor in her small hands when she thought no one was watching. On her 4th morning, carrying a breakfast tray up the curved staircase that probably cost more than her yearly salary, Tasha found herself pausing outside Vivian's door. She knocked once. Silence. The door opened to reveal Vivian curled on the floor beside her bed, not unconscious, but folded into herself like origami, eyes open but distant, breathing in shallow, careful sips. She looked up at Tasha with the kind of exhausted recognition that children shouldn't possess. "It hurts today," Vivian whispered, her voice barely disturbing the air. Tasha set down the tray and sat cross-legged on the Persian rug, her uniform crinkling against the silence. "I know, baby. I know it does." That moment didn't change the world. Not yet. But something shifted in that room, something soft and invisible threading between two people the mansion had taught to stay small. Meanwhile, in the service corridors below, the other maids folded laundry and folded gossip with equal efficiency. "I give her a week," one muttered, smoothing hospital corners on sheets that cost more than most cars. "She's got that look, like she's seen real struggle." "Struggle don't survive long in a place like this," another replied, not looking up from the towels. "Money don't like being reminded of what it can't fix." They didn't notice Tasha passing behind them, arms full of pillowcases, but she heard every word. That evening, as golden light painted the mansion's windows and Gregory's helicopter circled the estate like a mechanical vulture, she wondered if they were right. If places like this really did have a way of grinding down people who remembered what suffering looked like. The morning that would change everything started gray and heavy, storm clouds pressing down on the hills like a closed fist. Gregory had flown out before sunrise, Singapore or Zurich or some other distant city where his presence was worth millions and his absence went unnoticed by the daughter sleeping upstairs. By 9 a.m., the staff was scattered across their routines like pieces on a chessboard, each focused on their small squares of responsibility. The head maid complained about a detergent delivery. The groundskeepers obsessed over getting the outdoor terraces perfect for some investor dinner still a week away. No one mentioned that Vivian hadn't come down for breakfast. No one seemed to notice that her room had been quiet since dawn. In a house full of people paid to pay attention, somehow the child everyone was protecting had become invisible. Tasha climbed the stairs with growing unease, something cold spreading through her chest like spilled water. She knocked on Vivian's door. No answer. She knocked again, harder. When she pushed the door open, time didn't just slow, it stopped. Vivian lay halfway off her bed, her small body contorted in a crisis that was stealing her breath and her consciousness in equal measure. Sweat had soaked through her nightgown. Her lips had taken on the blue-gray tint that meant her blood wasn't carrying enough oxygen. Her hands clawed weakly at the sheets, as if she were trying to climb out of her own failing body. The room smelled sharp and wrong, like fear given physical form. Tasha dropped to her knees beside the bed, her hands hovering over Vivian's trembling form. "Baby? Vivian, can you hear me?" Vivian's eyelids fluttered. Her breathing sounded like paper tearing. Tasha lunged for the emergency call button mounted beside the bed. Dead. She sprinted to the hallway phone and dialed the private nurse's number posted beside it. Straight to voicemail. She tried Gregory's emergency line. For rings. 5, 6, then nothing. She slammed the receiver down and raced downstairs, her feet barely touching the marble steps. In the kitchen, she found two maids laughing over coffee and gossip. "I need help," Tasha gasped, her voice cracking with urgency. "Vivian's in crisis. She needs the hospital now." One of the maids didn't even turn around. "We don't go upstairs without clearance from the estate manager. She could die." Tasha's hands shook as she gestured toward the ceiling. The second maid waved dismissively. "We'll inform the proper channels. There's a process." Process. The word hit Tasha like a slap. While they talked about process, a child was suffocating in her own bed. She turned and ran back upstairs, taking the steps 3 at a time. Vivian was worse now, her chest rising too fast and too shallow, her small frame fighting a battle it was losing. Tasha looked down the hallway toward Gregory's private office, the room everyone knew was off-limits, protected by locks and sensors and the kind of invisible barriers that separated people like her from people like him. But she also remembered something most people wouldn't notice, the way the cleaning staff talked about that room, how the headmaid always kept the master keys on a red-tagged ring by the basement supply closet, labeled "Do Not Remove" in block letters. The same label that might as well have been a map. She ran downstairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. The key ring hung exactly where she remembered. She grabbed it without hesitation and sprinted back to Gregory's office. The door opened with a soft click that sounded like the world cracking apart. Inside, the office was a temple to wealth and power. Mahogany shelves lined with awards, a wall safe that probably held more money than Tasha would see in 10 lifetimes, and on the polished desk, exactly what she'd pray to find. Car keys to the Tesla in the garage, and a black money clip fat with $100 bills. She didn't think. Thinking was a luxury she couldn't afford. Tasha scooped Vivian into her arms, the child's weight almost nothing, but somehow heavier than anything she'd ever carried. Every step down the hallway felt like walking through glass. The cameras tracked her movement. Sensors blinked red. The mansion's security system was recording every violation, every broken rule, every second of her decision to choose a child's life over her own freedom. She didn't care. The Tesla's doors opened with a soft hiss as she approached, the car recognizing the key fob in her trembling hand. She laid Vivian across the passenger seat as gently as if she were made of soap bubbles, buckled her in with shaking fingers, and whispered, "Hold on, baby. Just hold on." The car pulled out of the estate's circular drive with a screech of tires that announced to the world that everything was about to change. Behind her, alarms began to scream. Security monitors throughout the mansion flashed red. Unauthorized access. Office breach. Vehicle theft. Within 60 seconds, 2 black SUVs were pulling out of hidden bays, their occupants speaking in clipped radio codes as they began tracking the Tesla's GPS signal. Tasha drove like she was carrying the last flame in a dark world, her knuckles white against the steering wheel, her eyes flicking between the road and Vivian's increasingly still form in the passenger seat. She ignored the GPS's suggested route and headed for Metropolitan General. Not the closest hospital, but the best one for pediatric emergencies. Traffic became a blur of honking horns and curse words shouted through windows. None of it mattered. Nothing mattered except the shallow rise and fall of Vivian's chest and the prayer Tasha kept repeating like a mantra. Hold on. Just hold on. The emergency room doors parted like the Red Sea as Tasha burst through them, Vivian limp in her arms. Help! She screamed to anyone who would listen. She has sickle cell. She can't breathe. The response was immediate and beautiful in its efficiency. Nurses materialized from nowhere. A crash cart appeared. Vivian was transferred to a gurney and wheeled away while doctors shouted medical terms that sounded like spells cast against death itself. A nurse paused long enough to ask, "Are you her mother?" "I'm her maid," Tasha replied, the words feeling strange in her mouth. "I'm just her maid." But there was no one else. The nurse nodded and disappeared after the gurney, leaving Tasha alone in the fluorescent bright lobby, the weight of what she'd done finally settling on her shoulders like lead blankets. Outside, tires screamed against asphalt. The estate security team poured out of their SUVs like water through a broken dam. For men in matching navy jackets, radios crackling at their shoulders, faces set in stone. They didn't need to search. They could see Tasha through the glass doors, standing alone in the middle of the lobby like a target painted in neon. "That's her," one of them said, pointing. They entered the hospital like they owned it, which, given Gregory Lancaster's donations over the years, they practically did. They surrounded Tasha without ceremony, handcuffs clicking around her wrists before she could even turn around. A nurse at the admissions desk looked up in alarm. "What are you doing?" "She brought in a patient who was dying." "She stole a vehicle," the lead security officer replied coldly. "And cash. She's under arrest for theft and kidnapping." The word kidnapping hung in the air like smoke, poisoning everything it touched. Gregory Lancaster arrived 23 minutes later, his helicopter touching down on the hospital's roof like a mechanical angel of judgment. He strode through the corridors in his perfectly tailored gray suit, his face a mask of controlled fury that made orderlies step aside and nurses avoid eye contact. The head of security met him near the elevators. "She's in holding. Local police are processing the arrest. We recovered the vehicle and most of the cash." "And my daughter?" Gregory's voice could have frozen water. "They're stabilizing her. The doctors say." The security chief paused, choosing his words carefully. "They say it was close. Very close." Gregory's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Dr. Elizabeth Chen approached them, her scrubs still damp with the sweat of saving a child's life. She was in her mid-50s, with the kind of steady confidence that came from decades of fighting death and winning more often than not. "Mr. Lancaster," she said, extending a tired hand. Gregory nodded curtly. "I need you to understand something," Dr. Chen continued, her voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Your daughter has sickle cell disease. When a crisis hits, we measure time in minutes, sometimes seconds. If that young woman hadn't gotten Vivian here exactly when she did." She paused, letting the weight of unfinished sentences do the work. "Your daughter would have died." The word echoed in the hallway like a gunshot. "Your phones were off," Dr. Chun continued relentlessly. "Your staff were unreachable. Your security protocols were too slow. That woman didn't kidnap your daughter, Mr. Lancaster. She saved her. Not your money. Not your systems. Her." Dr. Chin walked away, leaving Gregory standing in the hallway like a man who'd just discovered that everything he thought he knew about the world was wrong. In the small holding room down the hall, Tasha sat with her wrists still cuffed, her uniform wrinkled, her dark hair escaping from its ponytail. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She just stared at the white walls and waited for whatever came next. The door opened. Gregory stepped in alone. No lawyers, no security, no buffer between him and the woman who just shattered every assumption he'd built his life on. For a long moment, they looked at each other across a distance measured not in feet, but in tax brackets and life experiences and the kind of fundamental differences that usually kept people like them from ever occupying the same space. Then Gregory reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver key. He unlocked her handcuffs without a word. "Come with me," he said quietly. When Tasha didn't move, he added, "She's asking for you." The walk to room 314 was the longest and shortest journey of both their lives. When they entered, they found Vivian tucked under hospital blankets, for lines snaking from her small arms, but her breathing steady, her color returning to something that looked like life instead of its absence. When she saw Tasha, Vivian's face lit up with the kind of pure joy that medicine can't manufacture. "Tasha," she whispered, reaching out with fingers that were warm and steady. Tasha took her hand and felt the strong, regular pulse that meant she'd won. They'd won. Gregory stood in the corner, watching his daughter hold hands with the woman he'd hired to clean floors, and slowly began to understand that he'd spent his entire life building walls that had nearly cost him everything that mattered. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of forgiveness and the city settled into its nightly rhythm, something unprecedented happened in the Lancaster mansion. Gregory called an emergency press conference. The announcement sent shockwaves through his corporate empire, his social circles, and the media outlets that had spent years chronicling his business dealings. Gregory Lancaster didn't hold press conferences about personal matters. He didn't discuss his family. He certainly didn't invite cameras into his private world. But by 7 p.m., the mansion's gates opened to reveal a modest podium set up on the front lawn, surrounded by reporters who looked like they were covering an alien landing. Gregory stepped up to the microphone without notes, without a team of handlers, without the careful political language that usually characterized his public appearances. Beside him stood Tasha, no longer in her maid's uniform, but in a simple gray dress that someone had pressed for her just minutes before. Her hair was pulled back, her shoulders square, but her hands still trembled slightly. "Last night," Gregory began, his voice carrying across the crowd without the aid of amplification, "my daughter nearly died." The statement hit the assembled reporters like a physical blow. Cameras clicked in rapid succession. Notebooks flipped open. "The only reason she's alive today," he continued, gesturing to the woman beside him, "is because of Tasha Briggs. She broke rules. Yes. She took my car. Yes. She took my money. Yes. But she did what I couldn't do, what my staff wouldn't do, what my systems failed to do. She acted when action was the only thing that mattered." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, microphones, and camera lenses pointed at him like weapons. "In my world, we talk a lot about efficiency, about protocols, about proper channels. But sometimes the proper channel is the one that kills your child while you're following procedures." Tasha Briggs didn't follow procedures. She followed her conscience, and she saved my daughter's life. The murmur that rose from the crowd sounded like wind through tall grass. Effective immediately, Gregory continued, his voice growing stronger, "Tasha will not only remain as part of our household, she will never work as a maid again. I'm establishing a medical advocacy foundation in her name, with her as its director. Because if we're going to build systems that actually protect vulnerable children, they need to be designed by people who act, not just talk." Tasha turned toward him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Furthermore," Gregory said, "I'm donating $10 million to pediatric sickle cell research because my daughter shouldn't be the only child who gets saved by someone brave enough to break the rules." That night, in the mansion that had tried to keep her small, Tasha walked through hallways that would never look the same. The other staff members watched her pass with expressions that ranged from awe to envy to something approaching respect. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't just anything. Vivian recovered slowly but steadily. Her room in the mansion transformed from a sterile medical space into something that looked like a child actually lived there, filled with books and art supplies and the sound of laughter that echoed through corridors that had been silent for too long. The foundation that bore Tasha's name grew quickly, funded not just by Gregory's money, but by donations from people around the world who'd heard the story and recognized something true in it. Within 6 months, they'd helped establish new emergency protocols at children's hospitals across 3 states, trained healthcare workers in recognizing the signs of sickle cell crises, and most importantly, created a network of advocates who understood that sometimes the most important voice in a room belongs to the person everyone else has learned to ignore. Gregory learned to see his daughter not as a medical condition to be managed, but as a child to be celebrated. He learned that the most expensive security system in the world was worthless compared to someone who simply cared enough to act. He learned that the woman he'd hired to clean his floors had been capable of things his Harvard MBA couldn't teach him. But perhaps most importantly, he learned that heroes don't announce themselves with fanfare. They don't wear capes, or carry badges, or hold press conferences. Sometimes they're just the people who happen to be in the right place at the right time with the right heart, willing to risk everything for someone who can't risk anything for themselves. Tasha Briggs had entered the Lancaster mansion as invisible as air, dismissed as easily as dust. But she left it as something that no amount of money could buy and no system could manufacture. She left it as someone who'd proven that when everything else fails, sometimes the only thing that stands between life and death is a person who refuses to stand by and do nothing. The world had tried to teach her that her place was in the shadows, that her voice didn't matter, that her actions couldn't change anything. But on one gray morning, when a little girl needed someone to choose love over rules, courage over protocol, and action over approval, Tasha Briggs became exactly what she'd always been, a woman who wouldn't let a child die on her watch. Justice wasn't served in a courtroom that day. It was served in a hospital room by a woman who understood that sometimes breaking the law is the only way to keep faith with something higher than law. Sometimes the real crime isn't theft. It's standing by while someone suffers because helping them would be inconvenient. Sometimes the person they call, just a maid, turns out to be the only one in the room with the courage to act like a human being. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that heroes walk among us every single day, usually unrecognized, often undervalued, but always ready to rise when rising is what's needed most. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when the world needs them most.